Despite the healthy growth rate, the Philippines is still suffering from joblessness and poverty. For more insight into the Philippine economy, Ryan Hakim, an economist from Cascade Asia, joins us here at the NASDAQ studio. Welcome back to Biz Asia America. Look, this is a big deal because the Philippines has a lot of domestic workers around the world. Now, as a preference, they already have rights. How does this change the entire scale of the situation around the world for the Filipino worker?
Well, essentially, it's to create a consistent framework across all countries.
Because every country had different rules to begin with, so now you have one rule and it's standard.
And many other countries are also making that move for their domestic workers as well. So for Indonesia, for example, there were a lot of cases where the rights of domestic workers weren't being adhered to. So the government had to step in and also help some of that as well.
Give me an example of one of the infraction of rights that you come across.
Sometimes the wages aren't being paid fairly or paid at a market rate. Sometimes there's situations of abuse as well. And these are things that the government is trying to take more seriously.
Some of the countries involved here, in particular in Hong Kong, they're starting to limit the number of workers coming to a place like that. Is that related at all to these new rules, or is that something completely separate?
Partly, but I guess two things I can say to that is Hong Kong isn't generally the biggest market for domestic Filipino workers. The second thing is there's many domestic workers have a good command of English as well, and so for many employers, that's a really positive relative premium that they're willing to pay, and so it's not something that I expect would change the situation all too much.
Now, we were just talking here before we started the interview. You were talking how there's a correlation between the Fed policy and the Filipino economy and sort of this domestic worker situation. Tie that together for us.
Well, essentially, many investors are going to be looking to reprice the yields on U.S. Treasuries. And many people think that for emerging market countries, that's going to have a negative effect on their currency. But for the Philippines, it's actually quite resistant to those effects, largely because of its fundamentals. It has a very strong current account position. It has relatively low inflation. There are reserves that cover 13 months of imports and.
So you're basically saying whatever the Fed ultimately decides, it's not going to have a major impact on the Philippines, perhaps on other emerging markets.
Yes, it's not fully shielded, but it does have some protection. And remittances do play an important impact in lowering that effect as well.
This issue that we mentioned earlier, the jobless rate in the Philippines. Honestly, they've had a great economy the last couple of years. But the jobless rate is still a very big problem for the administration to deal with. Why isn't that perhaps gaining any traction?
Well, essentially, you have a mismatch between the jobs that are needed and the jobs that are supplied. A lot of the GDP growth comes from the service sector. And for that, you don't really need a huge labor force. And it generally requires highly skilled workers. Essentially, for the semi-skilled labor in the Philippines, you want to put them in the manufacturing sector. Again, the bottlenecks for that is the lack of adequate infrastructure in the country, and also wage premiums are generally much higher than they are in other.
This new law that we've been talking about, the International Labor Organization, saying that every country is going to treat these domestic workers basically the same. What's the longer-term impact on the Philippine economy?
Well, I suppose that if for the Philippines sending workers abroad, they're not going to, you're not going to see a fall in domestic workers going abroad. And so you're going to keep the remittances quite healthy.
Might you see perhaps a rise in salaries?
Rather than a rise in salaries, a consistent salary for domestic workers relative to domestic workers in that country from other countries.
So I'm going to try to think forward here. So after this takes place, the Philippine economy, as you look to 2014, what's the thing that perhaps worries you the most?
For domestic workers?
For the economy in general in the Philippines?
I think for the medium term, the fundamentals are quite strong. It's not relative to other emerging markets, especially in Southeast Asia. I think the Philippines is in a much better position. So in the medium term, nothing much. I expect the peso to depreciate marginally over the next year. But it's really not something that's going to be a huge issue.
So staying strong despite all the cross currents around the world. Ryan, Hakim, thank you very much for joining us from Cascade Asia.